All right, guys. Hey, okay, so it's Tuesday afternoon. I'm making this for you guys Wednesday. So you're watching this Wednesday in class. We're talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, and I'm relying on my notes. And so if it looks like I'm looking at the floor, I'm looking at my notes. It's sort of sitting in front of me here. What I want to talk through is what Aquinas gets us to. So we've made some progression. Aquinas begins by talking to us about a God, like the unmoved mover, is a necessary thing. And then a God who would be perfect is also necessary because of this issue of potential, which we talked about yesterday. And then finally, if we're going to talk about the God of the Bible, we have to use language to do that. But language is bad. Not in the sense that it's sort of morally bad or evil, but in the sense that it's not complete. It's not going to get us to where we need to go when we want to talk about this kind of stuff. And look no further than English, where we drive on parkways and park in driveways. Language has some serious sets of limitations. So if, for example, I were going to ask you to describe God without using analogies or metaphors, without using word pictures or figures of speech, without anthropomorphizing God, if I were going to ask you to describe God without using any of those terms, our language gets severely limited. And even if we were going to be able to use those terms, our ability to use those terms well and orient, guide, shape, direct the conversation and where it's going gets really complicated really fast. So here's where Aquinas goes with it. And I think that's what I'm going to do. It'll limit the amount of time you spend having to sort of suffer through listening to me on video. And it'll make this condensed and concise. And so here's the deal. We use language to describe God because it's the best tool in the toolbox that we have to do that task. And that requires us to use what's at our disposal in the language itself. Okay. We use language to talk about God. God made us. God made language. That means, since we're not God, and God gave us language, both us and language have limits. Because language, by necessity, is a set of symbols to communicate meaning. And so without being confronted with God face to face, we don't have what we need to understand or explain, to articulate. And even if we did encounter God face to face, I don't think we would have what would be necessary to explain what it is and how it is that we're encountering that thing. So God made us, and God gave us language. Because he made us, and we are limited, and he gave us language, we cannot fully use language to describe God. Perhaps because language is a tool of relating God's self to human beings, language itself can't fully express who and what God is. Because it has to come down from on high, so to speak, to us so that we can understand it. And the basic gist of this is we don't understand it because God's beyond our understanding. And because we can't understand it, we can't use the right language to explain it. Even when that language is revealed to us, that language has limitations. Because we are limited, language has to meet us on our level. So it leads Aquinas to his next point. What we say about God in describing him happens in relationship with God. So the words that we use and the way we use them reflect, deepen, enhance, shape the way we relate to the God we're trying to talk about. Let me do it this way. For human beings who know and love the God of the Bible, we talk about God in terms that are amiable and friendly and invite, welcome, embrace relationship with that God. We show our connection to God by the words we use in describing who and what God is. But we also show our disconnect from God as we use different words to describe our disconnect, our difference, our struggle, and our complication with being related to God. Which ultimately leads Aquinas to this point. On this side of eternity, we have limits, and no one is ever perfectly related to God. So then, there are no words adequate to express the God that is beyond words. We spend a lot of time trying to describe the God of the Bible. And St. Thomas Aquinas was dramatically more interested not in what we could describe of God, but how God describes us. And so what he says is, if we relate back to God what God gives us, then we express what we don't know and what we don't understand in a posture that's humble and willing to embrace and trust what God has told us is true, even if we can't fully understand it and embrace it and get around it. We don't know, and we don't understand the perfection of the words we echo by repeating back to God what God has told us of himself. And so where Aquinas goes with this is we have limits and language has limits, and we can't properly or adequately talk about God. But if we choose to talk about God the way God talks about God and allow ourselves to be described by God, then we're on the right track. Because then the God of the Bible, who knows the heart, judges the heart, sees and meets us halfway. We see what is missing only when we acknowledge the fact that we are totally reliant on God's revelation of God's self in order for us to describe the God we're talking about and relating to. We don't have the capacities to see and describe what God is. So human beings left to our own devices are actually better served to explain what we don't know, don't see, or don't understand about God. And instead of trying to articulate and define, describe, declare everything that God is, we would actually be better served to take what God has said of human persons and use that as a vehicle to explain what we are, where our limits lie, and then where the gap is between what we can understand of God and what we cannot understand about God. I'm going to stop there. So, God exists because of Aristotle's unmoved mover. That's a God. It doesn't have to be the God of the Bible. The potential we recognize in the space between what is and what we think should be, what we see as good, better, best, indicate to us a God like the perfect God of the Bible is necessary. Finally, we have something that reveals this God to us, but in language. And human language is incapable of fully getting itself around what it's trying to articulate, because language is symbolic. Which means we're right back at that potential. Even if we have the words and the tools God gave us to talk about God's self, we don't fully understand what we're talking about. And we never will, because humanity has limitations. God is not to be described as much as God is to be lived with, experienced, walked with. And this is part of the intention. And this is where Aquinas runs his intellectualizing into his spirituality. And here is where I can get on board Aquinas' train. Because God is beyond our ability to know, we're left with knowing God in relationship, not in intellectual truth. Because the truth will always be elusive in our human existence, our human understandings, and in our human capacities. All we're left with is relating to the God of the Bible on the terms the God of the Bible gave us. And so the best thing we could do is describe God on terms God gave us: love, righteousness, holiness, truth, beauty, justice, goodness, graciousness, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. These are all fruits of the Spirit. These are all things that the Bible describes to us as parts of God's character and nature and expressions of how God relates to and among us and with us. And all of that is well and good. But God is beyond our understanding. And so then we run into a text like the book of Job. And while Job knows what is true of God, that God is just and he's righteous and he's holy and he's right, what Job doesn't understand is how that existence of God relates to his existence as a human person in the cosmic scheme of justice. And here we find our limitation. We might be able to understand this individual isolated point. God is just. God is love. God is gracious to us. But when we try and step back and survey the entirety of the picture and get a full description, we're going to come up woefully short because we don't have the perspective to see the whole picture. We don't have the understanding to get around the entirety of it because God is beyond that comprehension. And so instead of simply striving for the purely intellectual understanding of who and what God is, we need to shift gears from knowing about God to knowing in relationship with God. Because God will always be elusive to us in some way, shape, form, and fashion. Because God is beyond us, totally other than us, connected and in relationship with us, and seeking us out and wanting to know us and be known, wanting us to know him and be known by him, but always a relationship that is set up where humanity has its limitations and will never be able to fully get around an understanding of what God is because we are limited. And language that makes sense to us doesn't fully express what God is. And the only way to get to a knowing the God of the Bible, to a knowing the truth of the God of the Bible, is to get to know in relationship the God of the Bible and to take him at his word, taste and see that the Lord is good. You have the rest of your time to work on your projects. Okay? We'll see you guys next time. Thanks, guys.